Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Martin Saniga. I'm Saponi from North Carolina, and I'm the supervisor here of the American Indian Initiative. Prior to my work here at Williamsburg, I worked at the Jamestown-Yorktown Foundation and also the National Museum of the American Indian. We're happy to have you today, and I'm going to allow my coworker to introduce himself.
Hi, my name is Talon Silverhorn. I'm a citizen of the Eastern Shawnee Tribe of Oklahoma, one of 3 federally recognized Shawnee tribes. That's where I'm from, down there in northeast Oklahoma, and I worked there for a little while before coming here to Williamsburg in the tribal government, our Office of Language and Cultural Preservation. Real quick, before we get started into our question and answer session, where we're going to be taking some of your questions and answering those, and just kind of doing a little bit of general talks on whatever people are interested in. I do want to let you all know that it is Native American Heritage Month, American Indian Heritage Month here in the United States, November, right? So we think about that kind of timeline, right? So even before Native Americans were considered citizens, in 1915, the first Native American Day was declared. If I'm not mistaken, I think it was November 15th. And then later on in time, about 1986 or so, President Ronald Reagan signed into effect the first Native American Week, November 23rd through the 30th. And as we know today, I think George Bush Sr. was the one who instated Native American Month, the month of November. And we think about that falling kind of right in line with things like Thanksgiving, or just previous to that, October 12th, which many states have started sort of going along with the Indigenous Peoples Day, Virginia being the most recent of those. So if you have any questions about that, or the kind of the timeline of Native civil liberties as they kind of line up with those days of recognition and points in time in which U.S. politicians and things are choosing to sort of point the spotlight at Native Americans, we'd be happy to answer those questions too. So while we're going through this and you're sending in your questions, I do want to make it very, very clear that you aren't limited to the 18th century, nor are we here at Colonial Williamsburg. We do a lot of third-person interpretation, and we do that so that we can answer modern questions. We do that so that we can kind of tackle misconceptions and stereotypes, where those things come from, and we can have conversations about ourselves as modern Indigenous people in the United States today. So with that, I would like to turn it over to our moderator for the questions.
Great, thank you guys. The first question I want to ask actually comes in relation to other Thursdays. A lot of our viewers, I'm sure, are used to seeing someone portray someone from the past. Do we expect to see George Washington or Thomas Jefferson, even though these are, of course, historians and scholars and actors portraying those? However, this is a little bit different. We're here with Talon and we're here with Martin. So does the American Indian Initiative here at Colonial Williamsburg ever portray characters of the past? Do you ever take on the personas of other Native peoples?
So at one point we did do some character work. The thing with our stories, and I say kind of R as a royal R, so Native stories here in Williamsburg, there are most literally hundreds of them. There's only one Thomas Jefferson, there's only one George Washington or George Wythe, but there are hundreds of Native people that come here as delegates for political business, that are boys that are attending the school, the Bradfordton School at William and Mary, that are from local tributary tribes like Pamunkey, Chickahominy, Nansemond, Nottoway, that are coming here and doing business, and it just kind of limits us doing character work. Being in third person, we can kind of go wherever the conversation with the guests take us, kind of like what we're doing today, speaking on modern and historic questions.
Great, thank you very much. We've already had some questions coming in, and Barbara has one that I think is, or not Barbara, I'm sorry, Amelia has one that I think is a good one to kick off with, because we've used a few different terms here. You are the American Indian Initiative. We've talked about Native American Day. We've talked about Indigenous peoples. What do all these terms mean? Is there one that's more appropriate than another? And Amelia's asking, is there a more respectful way to refer to you?
That's a great question, Amelia. So for ourselves, individuals are going to prefer different things. That's an ongoing conversation. And it's important to realize that, we think about Indigenous peoples, Native Americans, American Indians, First Nations, Aboriginals, good 18th century term, naturals, right? There are many different words that are going to be used by non-native people to describe us. However, you'll often find that the words we use to describe ourselves are going to be a little bit different. So my personal preference is, as long as it's well-intentioned and sincere, I can take that and I can actually sort of build that into something a little bit more meaningful. So, if I were to introduce myself in my language, I don't have the ability to pronounce Native American or American Indian or Indigenous. I would say, right? So I'm a Shawnee man. And that's the country that I come from, which is much different from Saponi or Cherokee or the other 570 plus federally recognized tribes in the United States today, right? So,
Great. Anything else to add to that, Martin?
I think the big thing, and Talon hit on it, all the terms are wrong. They're all terms that are in the English language. They're terms that we never used for ourselves. When we look at the term Indian specifically, it's the governmental term. It's what they use to designate us on census data and legal documents, so American Indian Religious Freedoms Act, things like that. So that's kind of that broader term and why that term is really stuck here in the United States, because it's our legal definition between our relationship and the federal government.
or something else.
Or something else.
Thank you, guys. Well, we've had questions flying in, so I don't want to dwell too long. Scarlett had a question. Can you tell me about traditions from Thanksgiving that have crossed over the heritage from Native peoples' traditions? I know that we are in the month of Thanksgiving, and you guys have some other things going on.
So thank you, Charlotte, for that question. Really, when you look at the biggest thing that crosses over, it's going to be food. And if you'd like more on that, actually on the 19th, we're going to be streaming some videos where we did some cooking earlier this week, talking about really where that idea and that concept of the American Thanksgiving comes from. Things like turkey, cranberries, pumpkins, corn, squash, potatoes. These are all indigenous food items that are then adopted into European cuisine once they start colonizing here. For us as Native nations, some people do celebrate kind of the modern Thanksgiving holiday, but traditionally there's no idea or really no concept of a single day to give thanks. There's so much in the world, such a huge bounty of things that allows us to live the life that we live, that every day, every meal is giving Thanksgiving and giving thanks for those kind of resources and opportunities.
Great, thank you. So I have one from Travis that is specific to you, Talon, a lot of what you just asked for. Can you tell us a little bit more about modern Shawnee people around in 2020?
Great question. So modern Shawnee people, I'll kind of start where we began in the Ohio Valley, right? So in the Ohio Territory there, Shawnee people were moved from that place in the 1830s and 40s down into northeast Oklahoma where we are today. So there are three federally recognized tribes of Shawnee. There are the Shawnee tribe, there's the absentee Shawnee tribe, and then there's the Eastern Shawnee tribe. And we all share, very, very, very similar culture and language, and life ways. And so, down there in northeast Oklahoma where I'm from Miami, I think the total population of our combined tribes is probably over 50,000 today. And so, we still have fluent speakers of our language. We run social programs and healthcare centers and support public libraries and education and things like that. And so we are modern people and do modern things and are trying to build up our communities to be as self-sufficient and sustainable as we can.
So now I'm going to flip it on the other side because Barbara wants to know how much contact did people of Williamsburg in the 18th century have with Native peoples?
That's a great question, Barbara. So it really kind of depends on which group of Native people you're talking about. Kind of in the beginning, we talked about those three broad stories. The boys that are at the Blackfoot Indian School to get an education on the campus of William and Mary. The local tributary tribes, those Pamunkeys and Nansmans, Chickahominys, Nottaways, Monacans, who are subjects of the crown as per treaties they signed in the 1680s. Those are going to be groups that are coming here and interacting in the same way that a lot of poor Virginia farmers are. So your average citizenry of Williamsburg, they can interact with those people. There are some special kind of rules and laws. One of the things that the citizenry of Williamsburg cannot do is they cannot insult Indian people by word or by deed. And so when these people are in town, they're treated with the utmost respect. Anyone violating that can be fined and put into prison. That kind of third component, as we're dressed today, these delegates coming from foreign nations, they're at the same status of king and crown. So they might get gawked at, they might be looked at by the citizenry of Williamsburg, but they're not interacting. So even people that we think of as prominent, Thomas Jefferson, Peyton Randolph, guys like that, they're still below the station of these Indian delegates that are coming here. Really, the one person that we can interact with on an equal basis is going to be the royal governor. He's the king's voice. He has the king's authority, and so those delegates are almost exclusively interacting with him or people that he's bringing into kind of that same social circle at big events like balls and things like that.
I vaguely remember there was a story from the 1730s about the royal governor taking some native royalty to the theater, I think. Thank you very much. I want to keep this going, and maybe in a similar line, Doug and Marketa are both wondering how common marriages between Native Americans and British and Europeans in general, how common that was in the 18th and 17th century.
That's a great question. So the answer is very, very common. So it may not be legal by European standards, but we think about people out on the frontier. Consider what we know today as much of Southern or Appalachian culture, right? So that mountain culture. Heavy mix of German, Dutch, Celtic, Native, African, and so we think about all those kinds of things. How many people do we know in the modern day that have a story of a Native ancestor, right? So where do all those stories come from? They may have been adopted. They may have married into a Native community. And so, we think about marriages to Native people. Those are extremely common. And especially if it's a Native woman marrying a non-Native man, that creates citizens for our community. Since we are matrilineal, matriarchal, most often, that individual, that trader, say for instance, may have a wife in Cherokee country here and another one over here in this town, and maybe one over in Catawba, and elsewhere along his travels. So
we've had a few questions about all things aesthetic and appearance. So I'll run a few of these back to back. Austin is going to start off by asking about what is the significance of tattoos, yours and your tribe?
So tattoos, we can almost relate them as our personal records. So anything that is a part of our broader society, our government, our nation, are going to be in things like this, wampum belts. So our laws, our constitutions, our treaties, our agreements, they're going to be kept in that. And that is going to be kept more or less forever. Our tattoos are our personal records. And so when we die, our records go with us. Tattooing can vary from community to community, tribe to tribe. Most often those tattoos, the meanings, what they signify is kind of deeply personal information that is for that individual and their community, not necessarily shared to a wide degree with outsiders.
Tattooing is actually in many communities still common, and in other communities coming back, just like language, you have preservation and revitalization as two different concepts. And so, my tattoos are all done traditionally. I did most of them besides this one here, but I grind my own ink, I make my own needles, and I create my own designs for my tattoos.
That's wonderful. Gwen is actually asking about the silver that you are both wearing right now and whether that has any significance.
So the silver is going to be traded. It's going to be a replacement for a lot of our traditional metal work. So prior to European arrival, as Native people, we are working metal. Here in the East Coast, it's mostly copper, silver, and some meteorite iron. But once European disease sweeps through and kills about 94% of the population, those large industrial kind of city areas, Cahokia and places like that, where those trades are being done, that stuff goes away. And when Europeans arrive here in force, that's when we start trading for, at first, European copper, and then once that floods the market and kind of devalues copper in general, silver becomes the thing. If you look around my throat and Talon's throat, we have gorgets or gorgets, depending on how you want to pronounce them. These are replacements for our traditional shell gorgets, which would be engraved with different designs. And so kind of just a direct replacement for that. The earrings, the other jewelry, they're just that. They're jewelry.
And last question that is about appearance. Scarlett wants to know if there is a significance to your hairstyles and what they are, or different hairstyles maybe that you're not that you have.
That's a great question. So in the Eastern Woodlands, most commonly the men you'll find do not have a full head of hair. I'm growing mine back out at the moment, but for the last couple of years, I have maintained a scalp lock, a traditional haircut for my tribe, in which all of the hair on my head is removed except for a small circular patch in the back. You'll see different variations of that across the Eastern Woodlands. A mohawk is a type of scalp lock as well. And so the tribes here locally, like the Susquehannock or the Pamunkey, where they have a mohawk on in the middle, long on one side and shaved on the other. But the concepts of our bodies and specifically our hair, for many tribes in the Eastern Woodlands, body and facial hair is considered to be unclean or unhygienic, and so it is removed by plucking, and same with the hair on the head, plucking with either fresh clamshells or, more commonly in the 18th century, what are known as Indian razors, coils of brass wire that are used as tweezers.
Great. And now getting back to, I suppose this could both be history and today, Diana wants to know if you can speak to the significance in Native American cultures. Were they represented in Williamsburg, and are they represented today at Colonial Williamsburg?
They're going to be really well represented historically, Diana. Like we said in the beginning, not a space in what is modern day Colonial Williamsburg could you go and not see Indian people. The College of William and Mary with the students at the Brafferton, those students also attending service at the Bruton Heights Parish Church, Indian delegations doing business at the palace, small delegations being housed in the local taverns, sometimes larger delegations, one Cherokee delegation having almost 200 members, being housed in a military encampment along some of the Greens areas. The tributary tribes that are going to come here and sell fish and game, pottery and baskets to the citizenry of Williamsburg and also to the taverns. So you could go into a tavern, you could eat off native-made pottery, you could eat game and fish that had been hunted by a native man. So yeah, they're definitely represented, and it would have been a normal part of society. I think people today, when they see us, are more shocked than anyone in the period would have been. We're a relatively new program. We've been doing full-time interpretation here for just under a decade. And so our presence, and we're growing the program constantly, coming up with new ways to interact with you guys as guests, and then also coming on and doing things like this that we can reach millions of people and answer their questions. So yeah, our representation is historic and both modern.
Wonderful. Jen has said that she is Blackfoot, and she was wondering if you knew, did Blackfoot take part in the European contact in the 18th century? I don't know if you know or are familiar with that particularly, but I figured it was at least worth asking.
Not as familiar with tribes like the Blackfoot. It's not something that we see in the particular research that we do that relates to Colonial Williamsburg and the East Coast here. But we do know that the French influence and Spanish influence extends much farther west than the English in the 18th century. So it is possible. And we do know that even if social interaction isn't occurring, goods through the trade, like cloth, like jewelry, metals, and other things like that, are making their way all across the American continent.
Wonderful. Thank you. The Courtney children, that's their last name, they were wondering how Native children, and specifically Native children from mixed families, how they were treated. Were they treated differently than, full-blood or non-Native children?
So, kids, in our own society, there isn't an idea of being a half or a quarter traditionally. Our identity isn't made up of like a racial category or genetics. Our identity is citizenship. So if your mother is from that community, then you are citizens of that community. It doesn't matter if your father is a European or an African or anything like that. Your mother, just kind of like Talon hit it on earlier, women are the ones that create citizens, either by adoption or by birth. And so in those communities, we today would say, it's a mixed marriage or an interracial marriage, and that's not really kind of an idea or a thought. If that person of color or that person is different from a different background than us, but they're a citizen regardless. As to their treatment in European society, it can kind of vary depending on their social status and who they know. You've got prominent people like Joseph Brant, who fights in the American Revolution, who today would be considered mixed ancestry, and he's a prominent leader. So it really depends on the individual community, the person, and the colony that they may or may not be living in.
And the concept of mixed blood in and of itself, I will also say, upon its introduction, with European colonization, takes the form as we know it today, and most people are familiar with it today in the United States as sort of a law with the Stigler Act of 1948. So we think about the concepts that many Native communities are, the standards that we are adhered to today, or that the United States populace may be familiar with, the language and terminology that people use, largely comes out of the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. And so the racial identity of Native peoples in the American mind is that of the 1940s and 50s.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Miles wants to know, can you talk a little bit about gender equality and how that is treated within different tribes?
So when it comes to tribes here in the Eastern Woodlands, we have what we call the Big Three. And the Big Three are some social characteristics that broadly define many communities here in the East. And that is agricultural, democratic, and matrilineal, right? So many communities are permanent sedentary farming communities, large-scale agriculture that supports roughly 80% of our diets. And the homes, the structure, which we say the creation and maintenance of society and citizens, and the labor that sustains society is mainly done by women. And so because of that, just like the story of the little red hen, the fruits of those labor also belong to the women. But men have equal rights to women. We vote and participate in government and can sometimes own property and things like that. And so when we look at what we would consider to be equality, we would consider it to be a fair and equal society, even to the point of our government. Elected officials, as a democratically elected government, are not supposed to have any more authority than anyone else in society. That of a chief shall have no greater authority than a child, as we say.
Wonderful, thank you. Marcus wants to know, how common were horses and horse culture in tribes in the 18th century?
So Marcus, horse culture arrives here with Europeans. So there were horses a long time ago here in North America. They go extinct for one of many reasons, and then they're reintroduced by Europeans. So that kind of grandiose horse culture that has been highlighted in Hollywood and in films, that's seen on the Great Plains, nomadic societies that are going after buffalo and antelope and herds of animals living in teepees and things like that. Here in the East Coast, horse culture is going to be a little different. They're going to be used as pack animals if they're even used at all. You have to consider the way that we live, that sedentary lifestyle. Until we start adopting really heavily European agriculture, we've been doing agriculture for several thousand years on our own. There's no need to change it. It's fed our societies and our settlements since time immemorial. There's no need to bring horses into it. And so you might see them being used by communities to haul goods to communities or from communities to trade and things like that. But there's no riding horses around. This is a densely packed kind of old growth forest, and horses just really aren't too much of use in all honesty.
So this next one comes from Austin. It's for you, Talon, specifically. He's asking what the Shawnee people believe happened to Tecumseh's body after the Battle of the Thames.
That's a great question. And you're not going to know if I'm telling the truth or not. I honestly, personally do not know. I do know that from what I hear from people back home in our community, and from people like Tecumseh's descendants and family who's still around, that his body was not captured, and so there was a body that was supposedly identified as Tecumseh, falsely identified as Tecumseh, that was then cut apart for war trophies, but it was not him, so far as I understand it. I personally do not have any details as to what happened to Tecumseh's body. But many Shawnee people say that he was buried somewhere safely.
Thank you. There was a question here from Travis asking about, does CW have direct relationships with the tribes that are discussed here in this programming?
I think that's one of the things that as museums we can always improve on is our relationship to our tribal nations. Museums, universities, other places of higher education have a long history of a rocky relationship, to be very generous. And so even when we have relationships and the relationships we do have, there's always kind of a process of continuing to build and strengthen that bond.
Great. Yeah, so it's one of those, it's still rebuilding. What you mentioned earlier, Talon, the revitalization as well as preservation, so maybe we're still working on that. Mina has a question about what was the reactions from Native Americans to the Revolution? What was their role in the Revolutionary War?
That's a good question.
That is a good question. So when we think about Native Americans and the Revolution, it depends on what tribe. I think that if any point that we can really hammer home is it depends. Very legal answer. It depends on, say, like the Shawnee or the Delaware, for example, who are very pro-British. The last 200 years, the English are our primary trade partners, and we see Native communities kind of really splinter for the first time in some cases. Where some may ally with the Americans because they're the most immediate threat. They're the ones who are coming into our territory and threatening our homes and lives and things like that. But the British are our trade partners and our strongest allies. And should we jeopardize the relationship that we have with them to fend off this violence here? Should we stay out of it entirely, right? This is a quarrel between the English father and his disobedient children. And so think about down in Cherokee country with Dragon Canoe and his father, the Chickamauga Cherokee, which break off from the main body and fight all the way up until the 1780s. Native communities fractured just like the colonies. So instead of rough thirds, for us it's a little bit different proportion, but even past the Revolution, the effects of that splintering are visible. Say in the War of 1812, the Shawnee fighting with heavy British assistance, still trying to kind of aid their British allies and vice versa. But yeah.
So we've had a question here, one from Ken, another asking, I lost it, about instruments specifically, but do we have any relics here at Colonial Williamsburg over at the museum that speaks to Native people's culture that you know of?
So we do have some items in our collection that we found at some of the different sites. So one that really kind of comes to mind, we're actually not too far from it, is the coffee house itself. There's a Cherokee pipe that's found there. And so there are objects in our collection. Whether they're on display at any given time, I can't say. That's more of a curatorial thing on what they want to display and how it's going to kind of fit into the larger work of those individual museums. Great. Well, we're coming to the end of our time, but I think we have time for 2 or 3 more questions here. One that I think would be really good to address would be, what are some of those common misconceptions that you deal with every day?
So when we think about common misconceptions, it's important to look at, I would say, the common perception or misperception of American Indian people in today's world. Like Martin said earlier, many modern Americans view us as things of the past. So there's an understanding when interacting with characters here in Williamsburg that they are not actually Thomas Jefferson, or this person is not actually George Washington, and so, but people that come and talk to us often ask, do you speak English? Do you live in a house? Do you know what a cell phone is? Do you have a car? Those kinds of things. And so, do you still hunt your food? Do you live in a teepee? Those are very common questions for us, and I think that speaks to the larger concept of just how invisible Native people are. One of my favorite phrases, is we are strangers in our own homeland. And so we look at that sort of foundation as a whole. If this is zero, many people starting here, And so the big ones there, do you live like modern people? Do you eat like modern people? Do you use money? There are many different ones that we hear. Are you real Indians, right? So again, the concept that the Indian identity is something concreted in the past, and that us existing in the modern world today means that we are not real Indians, right? And so, we think about the Native identity as a modern person. It's important to recognize that there are over 570 federally recognized tribes in the United States. There are over 350 unique languages that still have fluent speakers here in the United States that are either being preserved or revitalized. There are over 400 distinct religious or spiritual practices amongst the different tribes here, and that's just the United States. That doesn't include Canada or Alaska or Mexico and the people there who are also indigenous Americans. So I think that's probably the biggest one that I think a lot of others stem from, is the idea that our identity is one entirely of history. And who's to blame, right? I mean, the sources that people get about American Indian people are all historical sources. So period paintings, black and white pictures and drawings and things like that, texts, and I think when we look at even public education and sort of common knowledge, it stops largely at removal. So if the last thing they hear about American Indian people is they were removed, and there's nothing sort of contemporarily after that, then I think it's a natural thing to assume. And I would say it's not the fault of the person themselves that they were failed in that endeavor.
Is there anything else you wanted to add to that, Martin?
I think going along with that is that kind of, insects in amber. We've been frozen in time. I can say from my own personal experience of being publicly educated here in Virginia that really any mention of Native people, of Indian people, stops after the 1890s, and there was a small blurb about code talkers in World War II, but we're not seen as astronauts. We're not seen as tech people or scientists or lawyers or politicians. We're not seen as professional football players, and there are Indian people all throughout the American society, but we don't all have olive complected skin. We don't all have long black hair. We don't live and look as people expect. And so when people ask, that's almost always the first question: are you a descendant? And I think that's another thing, is that people don't understand. For Americans, it's a racial category. Indian people are a race. For us, we're citizens of individual nations that are as different from each other as the US is from Japan or Germany or Iceland, but we are citizens first, and what we look like has very little to do with our own citizenship. You have people who would present as white, or people that may present more as Native, or people that present as African American in our communities, and that doesn't matter. It's citizenship. It's not about what you claim, it's about the community claiming you.
Thank you so much. So we have time for, I think, maybe two more, and we have some really good ones here. So Michelle, I apologize. I've been waiting on your question because I think it's a really good one. Caitlin asked something similar, but Michelle was saying she is trying to find a curriculum for my sons to study Native American people, and it seems like there are a lot of resources out there written by non-Native peoples. Are there sources that you recommend? Caitlin was also asking it not just for children, but for adults as well. Are there places that you would recommend us to go?
So I think that kind of highlights a larger problem that kind of butt-ins to that last question of, for 400 years, our story has been told through the eyes of colonization. We haven't had a voice in our own stories, or a voice in how we're educated about by the broader community. It's hard for me to recommend one source because I don't know where you're from. And so just like we were talking about, each of our tribal nations is different. The best thing to do is, if you have federally recognized tribes in your state, to reach out to them and ask them for information that you can use to kind of better educate yourself and your family. And I think the same with the other person, asking for adults is, a lot of it's the same. There are some good kind of historic stuff that we use, mainly pertaining to the East Coast, but if you want to learn about California natives, my recommendations are not going to really get you anywhere. But you can look up, there are lists of Native scholars and Native authors. You can look through those and find those and really kind of narrow your search that way.
A couple of good places that I would recommend starting your search. Again, like Martin said, it would be easier to kind of tailor the information to your specific locale, which is what most places do. But for the United States, I would say the Bureau of Indian Affairs list of federally recognized tribes is a good one because it not only goes by state and lists the federally recognized tribes in alphabetical order and by state, it also can provide you with some links to their tribal websites and resources that they will provide you with information and curriculum and things like that, and resources to do a little bit of learning. You can also go on some, native publications and newspapers and newsletters and things like that, like Indian Country Today, or the Native Times, and they often are writing pieces about, a list, like, we all see internet lists of the top 10 this or the top 10 that, the top 10 indigenous, educators in, this particular field, or, so I would say that's another good place to look as well.
All right, gents. I'm afraid we've come to the end of our time, but we have one last question here, and it is from Malia from Missouri. And she wants to know, I think it's fine if both of you answer this, can you tell us one question you wish guests would ask you about your history? What's the one thing you wish they would understand?
You can go first.
Yeah, so it's not often we get asked about what we hope or we wish the guest would kind of talk to us about. Mine isn't so much a question, but it's realizing that there is a difference. I think it's hard for people to kind of break down those stereotypes that they've grown up with. Hollywood has done an incredible job. Movies and theaters and books have done an incredible job of kind of creating this misconception about Indian people, that we live in harmony, that there's two extremes. We're either incredibly peaceful and live in balance in nature, or we're bloodthirsty savages, and there's no in between. And that's simply not the case. That's not the case with any group of human beings around the world. And I think the big takeaway I would like from people, more than a question, is just to kind of internalize what they hear and what they learn here and pass that on, and be supportive when they hear those stereotypes, to say, hey, I've talked to Indian people, I know some things, I've learned a little bit more. Like, I don't think all this stuff is quite right.
I would say for me, it's a couple of different things in tandem with one another. I would say the first is, and the biggest one, I think, that sets up a foundation for everything else, is that indigenous people, just like colonialism, is not something of the past that has happened and now we are descended from. It's an ongoing process, and we are ongoing people that exist in the modern world today. And from that foundation, once you understand that, asking questions just like that. What do you want me to know? What is something you wish people knew? And the idea or the question that wraps it up for me, that I hear when I ask, do you have any questions? People respond, I don't know enough to ask a question. I would like to respond, why do you think that is? Why is there such a gap in knowledge? Why do people know so little about the first inhabitants of this land, who have been your neighbors for 250 some years? And from there, sort of getting up to speed as to, now we're standing on equal ground. Let's talk about what I, as an indigenous person, want for our relationship in the future, because that's important to us. We can talk about our history all day long, and we've done it for the last 60 or so years that we've really had the opportunity to get into these things and to be a part of these spaces. But now, I think it's important for us as Indian people, we'll look at what we're doing in food sovereignty, in healthcare, in communications, and our online presence, TikTok, and anything else that you see in the world today. There is a native presence there, and we're using it to build a relationship with the community that we haven't been able to do before. And that is very, very, very special to me, and that's why I think, for me, that's why I'm here, is to kind of hit it at the source, to say this is where we live in people's minds. Let's take that as it exists here and bring it up to speed with the rest of us so that we can move on. So, but
thank you guys so much. There are still several questions we weren't able to get to, but maybe as a way of sending off, you can let them know how to keep asking questions and some of the other things you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so the easiest way, you comment on here. We can try to get some answers back to you here. If you're local or you come visit, you can find us at the Palace, or the Coffee House in the afternoon, or the Hinnage. So there are tons of programs. You can ask any employee here on the street, any of our interpreters, where to find us, and they'll direct you to us. And we're more than happy to sit and talk and chat with you guys and create an understanding and build that bridge.
And with that, I do believe that is our last and final question. And I want to thank you all for joining us for this live stream today. I want to thank you for your questions. They were excellent. And I would like to encourage you to check out some of our other Facebook videos, to visit us in person here, and to send us more questions so that we can do more videos just like this. So I want to thank you, and I want to thank the people that make these programs possible, and I would like to tell you all to have a nice day.